Okay, let's go ahead and get started this morning on our class. We are going to be wrapping up the study of the time between the Testaments today, and perhaps spending a little time talking about last week's sermon if we want to do that. But primarily, I intend this to be focused on kind of a review, and not a review so much as just a summary. We covered a lot of material over the course of a fairly short amount of time, so I want to kind of leave you guys with kind of the big points of what we looked through. Because again, the purpose of this was really to kind of get us from where we see the Jewish state being at the end of the Old Testament to where we see Judea being at the beginning of the New Testament, because it's a radically different environment. It's 430 years later, and even though things aren't moving quite as fast during that period of time as things are today in terms of technology and world governments and things like that, a lot of stuff happened. And so we did want to talk about that. But let's start over in Luke chapter 19. In Luke chapter 19, Jesus, when he approaches Jerusalem, it says that he saw the city and wept over it, saying, "If you had known in this day, even you, the things which make for peace, but now they have been hidden from your eyes. For the days will come upon you when your enemies will throw up a barricade against you, and surround you, and hem you in on every side, and they will level you to the ground, and your children within you. And they will not leave in you one stone upon another, because you did not recognize the time of your visitation." So I decided after Jerry's request last week that I would spend a little bit of time today talking about the remaining things that happen in Judea while it's still a Jewish place, through a little beyond AD 70, actually, a little bit beyond the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, but essentially through that point. And these prophecies that Jesus makes in Luke 19, and in a second we're going to see in Luke 21, are directly focused on that destruction of Jerusalem, that consequence that's going to happen in AD 70. In Luke 21 he says, while some were talking about the temple, that it was adorned with beautiful stones and votive gifts, he said, "As for these things which you are looking at, the days will come in which there will not be left one stone upon another, which will not be torn down." And a little later in that same chapter he says, "When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains, and those who are in the midst of the city must leave, and those who are in the country must not enter the city, because these are days of vengeance, so that all things which are written will be fulfilled. Woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days, for there will be great distress upon the land and to this people. And they will fall by the edge of the sword and will be led captive into all the nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled." So Jesus gives this fairly apocalyptic prophecy. In this case, I'm using the word apocalyptic not in the sense of it necessarily being cryptic or couched in euphemism or metaphor and imagery, but rather there's an apocalyptic event that's coming. There's a great destruction that's going to come. And so as we talk about wrapping it up, as we talk about finishing this thing, I'm using that in two senses. The sense of wrapping up the series, but also the sense of sort of wrapping up Jerusalem and Judea as a relevant factor in the religious progression of God's people. So we talked last week about, I call this the end times. Anybody know when the end times are?
Now.
Now? Okay. When did they start?
Once Jesus ascended.
Probably higher.
Okay. So once Jesus ascended, or depending on that or the day of Pentecost, depending on how you want to parse it down, but either way, they started then and they're still going on now. So the end times have been going for a while now, you know, but we are in the end times. But here again, I'm using the term end times in kind of a tongue-in-cheek way, because it's also, specifically in this context, the end of Jerusalem and Judea that we're looking towards. But we saw that we had the area of Judea, what had been the Hasmonean kingdom, was split up among several different rulers. Herod Archelaus, who governed Judea, Samaria, and Idumea. Herod Antipas, who governed Galilee and Perea. And Philip, who governed the north territories and the Transjordan territories. And this is kind of a map that lays it out for you. This is Herod Archelaus' territory. This is Herod Antipas' territory, these two areas here. And the red is up here. Now, Herod Archelaus is not going to last very long. He's dead by, or he's actually been deposed by AD 6. Herod Antipas is the Herod that is referred to, who is involved in the trial of Jesus. Even though he was not the king in Jerusalem, his provinces were up here, he was nevertheless the closest thing to a Jewish king that the Jews had to appeal to when they wanted to execute someone. So this is kind of the layout of things here. One of the things that happens next is that a guy named Judas of Galilee leads a rebellion in AD 6. This is a Messianic rebellion. It's a rebellion built around the idea that maybe Judas is the Messiah. He's hoping for that, so he has a go at it, and it doesn't turn out very well for him. And in fact, actually, he's referred to over in Acts chapter 5 when the apostles are brought before the Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin is trying to figure out what to do with them because they're preaching about the Messiah. And one of the scholars, Gamaliel, who was at that time a very famous scribe and scholar, says, don't mess with them. He says, some time ago, Theudas rose up, claiming to be somebody, and a group of about 400 men joined up with him. But he was killed, and all who followed him were dispersed and came to nothing. And then he says, after this man, Judas of Galilee rose up in the days of the census, and drew away some people after him. He too perished, and all those who followed him were scattered. So in the present case, I say to you, stay away from these men and let them alone, for if this plan or action is of men, it will be overthrown. And he goes on to say, and if it's from God, you don't want to get in the way of that. Now, the Judas of Galilee thing, as I said, it was a Messianic thing, but his particular complaint that got the whole thing started was he didn't like the census. This was a census that would have been similar to possibly even the same census that is recounted when we're talking about the birth of Jesus. But in any event, he didn't like the census, he didn't like the taxes that were associated with the census, so he led a rebellion, and it was quite unsuccessful. However, it was big enough that it really, really irritated the Romans, and because of that, the Romans decided that Herod Archelaus should be removed from his kingship. The area in which Judas actually led the rebellion was in Herod Archelaus' territory. So they remove him as a king, and Judea, Samaria, and Idumea become a Roman province of Judea, or Judea, I guess. I'm not going to try to say it like that. As a province, they don't have a king anymore. They have a Roman governor. The first governor is a guy named Pontius. So what happens by the time that Jesus is doing his ministry is you have, even though you have still have separate sections, this section is a Roman principate or territory. These kingdoms still exist as separate kingdoms, but essentially the whole area is one big Roman territory with different ways of controlling it. Okay, so Pontius Pilate is significant, obviously, in the story of Jesus. He was the fourth Roman governor of Judea. That was from AD 26 to 36 is when he governed. In AD 37, Herod Agrippa I, this was one of the sons of, this is actually the grandson of Herod Agrippa, of Herod the Great. Herod Agrippa I is made king over Philip's territories. If you remember, Philip was the one that had the stuff in the north and the stuff on the other side of the Jordan. Herod Agrippa was made the king over Philip's territories. This is because he was friends with the Roman emperor that took office in AD 37, who was Caligula. And Caligula took over and made him king over Philip's territories, took them away from Philip, and that was the end of that.
Is he the one that's referred to in Paul goes before and about Acts, end of Acts?
He's the one who's referred to as the one who exalts himself and dies.
And dies.
We'll get to that in just a second here, actually.
Okay.
But yeah, so then there's this interesting saga of Caligula. Caligula was pretty crazy and definitely a little bit full of himself. And so he decided that there should be a statue of him in Jerusalem. And specifically, he decided that there should be a statue of him in the middle of the temple in Jerusalem so that people could worship it, because after all, that's where they go to worship. And you got to remember, when you deal with somebody like this, and I'm not talking about him being crazy, I'm talking about him being never really having had any real interaction with the Jews. This totally would have made sense to him, because he's thinking, it's a temple. Temple is where things get worshipped. People worship me. That's where my statue should go. Unfortunately, of course, for the Jews, that's not exactly the way they think about it. So this is going to be a huge problem. And so Caligula decides he's going to send a statue. Well, fortunately, some of his governors, some of the regional governor and some of his other people kind of sat him down and said, no, you don't want to do that. We're trying to keep these people peaceful, and that will set them off. Let's not do that. So he said, okay. And then in 39, he's like, no, I still want one. So he was going to send it again. So he decided to send it again. Well, I think he actually got it. He like ordered it basically. And whoever was kind of in charge of ordering it on his behalf basically said, just really take your time on this. You know, we're in no rush to make this happen. So it kind of got delayed and delayed and delayed. And about the time that it was ready to go, Caligula died and somebody else took over who was a little more sensible and said, yeah, let's not do that. So it never got there. And fortunately, it didn't actually get set up. But the Jews were well aware that's what he wanted to do, and it actually, there's a lot of reason to think that this is actually the first big falling out between the Jews and the Romans. That even though the Jews weren't happy about having the Romans there, that this is the biggest one where the Romans really start to disrespect the Jewish religion, and that's what usually set them off. So anyway, it was kind of an interesting situation. Whoops, I didn't mean to do all three of those at once, but that's okay. So in AD 39, Agrippa I, remember, he's already been made king over Philip's territories in the north and across the Jordan. Now he's made king over Herod Antipas's territories, which include the Galilee and a couple of other things. And then finally in 41, he's made king over what used to be Herod Archelaus's territories. So basically he becomes king over all of Idumea, over all of Judea during that period of time. And so for a brief period of time, for 3 years there, even though it's still a Roman territory, Herod, this time the grandson of the first Herod, is in control of the whole area again, briefly. But he dies in AD 44, and the story that we referenced earlier, in Acts chapter 12, it says Herod, and this would be Herod Agrippa I, was very angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon, and with one accord they came to him, and having won over Blastus the king's chamberlain, they were asking for peace because their country was fed by the king's country. On an appointed day, Herod, having put on his royal apparel, took his seat on the rostrum and began delivering an address to them. And the people kept crying out, the voice of a God and not of a man. They're just flattering him because they wanted to do what they want. But it says that immediately an angel of the Lord struck him because he did not give God the glory, and he was eaten by worms and died. He wasn't immediately eaten by worms like right that second, but historically he actually did basically have some kind of a violent illness while he was giving his speech, and was taken away and died within a few days of basically parasites or something like that. So what's interesting with Herod Agrippa I is part of the reason why this may have happened is ironically because he was actually one of the most, or actually by far the most faithful of all of the Herod family in terms of his faithfulness to Judaism. He engaged in temple worship as he should have, not by taking over, but by letting the high priest do it and by being attentive and being involved. He supported Jewish causes. He didn't just build a bunch of stuff the way his grandfather had, but he contributed to a lot of different Jewish causes, and basically was, for all, as far as anybody can really tell, he was a very devout Christian, or a very devout Jew in his practices. So ironically, when he got up there and this happened, he, more than any of his other forefathers or family members, should have known better than to allow that to go on. But he didn't, and because of that, he was killed by God. So that's that. Okay, let's see. I forgot to turn the page, so I have no idea what's about to happen next. Well, let's just find out together. Okay, so his son, Herod Agrippa II, is later, not immediately, it's sometime later that he's made king over those northern territories that Philip had once controlled. That happens, or actually shortly after that happens, Nero Claudius Caesar becomes the Caesar, and of course Nero has it in for the Christians and to a lesser extent for the Jews, and so it's under Nero that the first significant persecution of the Christians takes place when Rome burns down. And this is also the first time we actually see the Roman government making any sort of a distinction between Jews and Christians. Up until that point, the Roman government had viewed Jews and Christians as the same thing. The Christians were just a sect of Judaism, and because of that, since Judaism was legal, Christianity was considered to be a legal religion within the empire as well. And even though Nero engaged in this persecution, that still continues to be the case. They are still considered to be a legal religion and an offshoot of Judaism. He just persecutes them in specific ways. Yes?
Would he have been the one that ordered the Christians out of Rome that's referred to?
Yes.
Okay.
And actually there again, that probably, in the context that's, well, the actual thing says he ordered the Jews out of Rome, but in fact history tells us that it was really more the Jewish Christians that got ordered out of Rome, not Jews more broadly, and that fits in with kind of Nero's, whatever he decided to focus on the Christians, that was kind of his modus operandi, so yeah. Okay, so during his time, Porcius Festus becomes the 13th Roman governor of Judea from 60 to 62, and of course he's significant because he is involved with the trial of Paul, as is Agrippa II. This King Agrippa is the one who's involved with Paul's trial during the latter part of Acts. So Agrippa and Festus are the ones that are involved in the decision-making process there that ultimately sends Paul off to Rome. Okay, so that's kind of the significant events that we see taking place in the book of Acts, or related to the things that we see taking place in the book of Acts. In AD 66, things take a significant turn for the worse, and there begins a war, a rebellion from the Jews against the Romans. It lasts for 5 years, from 66 until 70, and it doesn't end well for the Jews. In AD 70, Jerusalem and the temple are destroyed just as Jesus prophesied. The temple is leveled and Jerusalem is reduced to rubble, and essentially no one is going to live there for a while. As a consequence, or kind of in the course of mopping up from that war, Qumran, which is a fortress that was held by some of the Jews, is destroyed somewhere between AD 68 and AD 73. It's not entirely clear. Sorry, Qumran is not a fortress held by the Jews. Qumran is where the Essenes lived. That's where the Dead Sea Scrolls were left. Qumran is destroyed as part of this whole process somewhere between 68 and 73 AD. And then finally Masada, that's the fortress I was thinking about, is besieged starting in AD 73, and ultimately it is destroyed, and the Jews that are living there are thrown out in AD 74. And once they finish that, it's pretty much over. At that point, the Jews no longer, they're dispersed by the Romans. There are still some Jews left behind, kind of like there were after Babylon took them into captivity. Enough, in fact, to start another revolt, and I want to say AD 114, that basically ended with the Romans killing every Jew they could find, renaming the entire area so that it didn't have the words Jew or Jerusalem or Judea in it. They renamed it completely, and they settled it with Roman legionnaires on the theory that it'd be pretty hard for the Jews to really get back into control of things if their army was the one that was living there. So that was how the Romans finally wrapped this whole thing up. And so for all intents and purposes, Jerusalem and Judea ceased to be Jewish in the later half of the 1st century, the early part of the 2nd century, and it will not be truly Jewish again for a very long time. So,
and that included doing away with the genealogies that apparently were kept in the temple?
Well, I don't know where the genealogies were kept. There are still some Jews today that would argue that they can track their genealogies, but the loss of genealogies probably happened during the dispersion, but also during, I mean, there's been multiple dispersions over the years. You know, the Jews have been dispersed to one area and then just been dispersed to another area, and so over the course of those, I'm not exactly sure when, but over the course of those, the genealogical records were gradually lost, or at least became a lot cloudier. So, yeah. At this point, there are definitely some not Messianic Jews. There are definitely some ultra-Orthodox is not the right term. There are some pro-Zion Jews who believe that they can identify the high priest's line, for example, still. But they're working off of highly suspect information. So, and the majority of Jews today would not agree with that. But then the majority of Jews today are Orthodox or Reformed, but the Orthodox Jews are Rabbinical Jews, in which case they're not really that super interested in restoring the temple anyway, because their power is built around scholarship and the oral Talmud and some of those things, and so the temple isn't nearly as important for them as it was in the past.
Another question related to more of the time when Paul was there and late Christ. How did the Jews worship as Jews? I mean, the New Testament does not refer to any sacrifices, animal sacrifices being offered. How did they worship as Jews attempting to, I mean, I know the synagogues were in place now during that time, but how did they worship?
So the temple worship, there are two aspects to Jewish worship in the first century. Temple worship and synagogue worship, or local worship. The temple worship was primarily centered around the three high holy days: the Feast of Booths, the Passover, and the Feast of Weeks. And those three events, every male Jew was expected to go to Jerusalem to be there for those events. Those are where the public sacrifices were made, and the ones that were specifically prescribed for those holy days. And so that's where those took place. Beyond that, if you wanted to be compliant with Jewish law even more fully, and you had committed a sin, or had a child or whatever, you would go to the temple in Jerusalem to offer sacrifices. You would go for a sin offering, or you would go for to pay the tax on your newborn son, or you would go for all the different things that were set out in the old law. That the temple was used for those things. Sacrifices did not happen elsewhere in Judea during this period of time. The rest of the time, people, for the most part, worshipped in the synagogues, because the temple isn't really designed for worship. It's not. If you look at the layout of the temple, there's no place for like a congregation to gather and do worship stuff. It's a place where sacrifice is supposed to take place. And there's really no indication, even in the Old Testament and in the law of Moses, that the temple was designed to be the place where worship other than sacrifice took place. And sacrifice is an aspect of worship, don't get me wrong, but it's a specific aspect. The rest of the time, the Jews or the Israelites were expected to worship in where they lived. It's not practical for them to be going to the temple to worship every week or however often they're going to do it. So for the most part, they worship in the synagogue. In the synagogue, they would do scripture reading, there would be prayer, there would be singing, there might even be, they look a lot more like a church than the temple does, the modern day Church of Christ or whatever. There would probably be someone who would deliver some kind of a homily or some kind of thoughts about the scripture that was read. So there was a lot of these kind of things, and by the same token, the synagogue also served as a place of gathering and recreation, not like ping pong recreation, but a place where they could come together and they could study throughout the week. They could gather and have some kinds of fellowship together, so to speak. So the synagogue was the focus of the Jewish spiritual life in a way that the temple really wasn't. The temple was really a place where you went to sacrifice, because that's what you were supposed to do 3 times a year. So, Eva, did you have a question?
Is this way past or the 12 tribes?
Yes, I think. So the 12 tribes, the last time you really see the 12 tribes broken down is towards the end of the book of Samuel, at the beginning of the first Kings. And by now, the Jewish people are made up of all the different members of the 12 tribes. They're part of it, but they don't really think of themselves in terms of being, a Simeonite or somebody from Judah or whatever. They're still aware of their lineage, but they think of themselves more as Jews than as a specific tribe. So, any other questions? Okay, so let's go on. We're going to do, like I said, this is the end of the new material. So we're going to go back through. I want to do kind of a briefer or quick review here. So let's start off with kind of a quick overview of the rulers of Judea once things all went south. The first one is the Babylonian Empire. They ruled from 605 to 539. They were taken over by the Persian Empire, which ruled from 539 to 333 BC. They were taken over by Greece, which ruled from 333 to 152. And remember that Greece was split into 4 big areas. The 2 that were ruling over Judea at different times were Egypt, the Ptolemies, and Syria, the Seleucids. So there were 2 different groups that kind of were vying for control. Then the Hasmonean Empire, for that brief period of time between 152 and 63 BC, actually ruled Judea by Jews. And then finally Rome ruled from 63 BC until somewhere around AD 130. In AD 130, the Western Rome was collapsing, and the territories in that area were repeatedly switching hands between Persians and Rome and several different nations, and so it gets all muddled after that point. So those are the people that are ruling it. When we look at the Babylonian Empire, the things that are significant that happened during the Babylonian Empire is the development of the early prayer, study, and meeting houses. As I said, with the synagogue, these are the functions of the synagogue. And early on, during the period of time when the Jews were in Babylon, with no picture of when they were going to maybe return, they began to come up with ways to worship on their own, apart from the temple. And that involved coming up with prayer houses and study houses and meeting houses. And initially, each one had a different function. It wouldn't be until later that the synagogue would begin to unify those functions. And then also the early rabbinical developments. Again, when you don't have all your priests with you, when you don't have all your scrolls with you, when you don't have all your materials, you kind of end up basically looking around the room and saying, okay, who remembers best? And the guy that remembers best kind of becomes in charge and starts kind of recounting things and stuff. And if you happen to be somebody whose job had been to painstakingly copy part of the scroll of Isaiah your whole life, you probably knew that section of Isaiah really well. So what would happen is the scribes also would be highly important in this process. Okay, that's about all that happens during the Babylonian Empire, because it's not real long before something else happens. Did you have a question, Ian?
No.
Okay, couldn't tell. Your hand was kind of up, and I never know for sure. And I don't run over people. So, okay, so the Persian Empire takes over, and the most important thing that happens under the Persian Empire is that the Jews are allowed to return to Judea. And once they get back there, they build the second temple. And one of the major things that happens in that whole process is that the Levitical priesthood finally assumes the dominance that probably God intended for it to all the way back in the book of Judges. They become the center of authority, both secular and religious, within Judea, within the Jewish state. They also eliminate mixed race marriage, and there is this focus on sort of the uniqueness of the Jewish person that becomes a major focus throughout the Persian and later on the Greek empires as well. And then the other big thing is that the language Aramaic becomes increasingly well known and used throughout the world. Okay, that is Persia. Next we move over to Greece. During the time of Greece, that kind of is interesting. That one just sort of popped in the bottom there. During the time of Greece, let's start with that one. There's an increasing level of Jewish versus Samaritan hostility. That kind of got started during the Persian period, but it really gets moving during Greece because there's a lot of sort of political plays for power using Samaria, or Samaria using Judea as kind of a proxy to make bad things happen. So the other things though that happen is you get this definitive set of scribal duties and regulations. The scribes are the ones who copied the law, copied the books of the Torah, all of the books, and how they were supposed to do that, the process they followed, that is finalized during this period of time. The books of history are actually wrapped up during this period of time. Now, some of the history that's recorded was already done, but some of the finalization of, for example, the Chronicles was done during the period of time when the Greeks controlled Jerusalem and Judea. The canon, and I don't mean the kind of thing that launches shells for a mile and a half. I'm talking about the list of books that is considered accepted and legitimate for the Old Testament. Now, the Jews would not have called it the Old Testament, they would have called it the Bible, but their scriptures are assembled and they're basically locked in during this period of time. And then finally, Aramaic replaces Hebrew in daily use. I said it had begun to become more and more popular during this period of time. Hebrew becomes not exactly a dead language, but it becomes a language that's only spoken by a few on a regular basis, whereas Aramaic is used by the average person. Going on further, I don't know what the problem is with this, but for some reason, during the time of Greece, we have the Essenes Emerge. These are the guys named Qumran. This is a sect of the Jews. They're a very self-denying sect. They don't believe in owning anything expensive or valuable or whatever. They believe in living a life of self-denial. They believe in doing charity. They don't just go off and secrete themselves away in Qumran, though. There are communities of Essenes within any given Jewish city. There are communities of Essenes that are there as well. They're best known for what they did in Qumran with the books, the Dead Sea Scrolls, but that's not their only contribution. So, in a lot of ways, you could make an argument that the Essenes are closer, in some ways at least, closer to what we would think of as the way that modern, or that first century Christians tended to think about how they should act and behave than any of the other Jewish groups, certainly than the Pharisees or the Sadducees. But I don't want to make that sound like it's a one-for-one kind of a thing, or that Jesus came out of this sect or anything, because that's not at all likely. It's just that it just happens that the ways that they behave tend to line up pretty closely.
If I remember right, they were like isolationists, and they were all men.
Zealots?
The ones at Qumran were. In general, that was not true, though. There's been some confusion from a scholarship standpoint about that, because the discovery of Qumran was so significant that it sort of overshadowed what history already knew about the Essenes and what they learned afterwards. And the people at Qumran were a male-only community, and they were isolationists. But the Essenes that lived within other cities were not isolationists. Now, they didn't like associate heavily with other Jewish people, but they did marry, and they did have families, and they just tended to be kind of, you know, it's kind of like an Orthodox Jewish community today. If you go to New York City, you can find any number of them, and they live in the world, and they interact with other people, but for the most part they kind of keep to themselves, and the Essenes were kind of like that. Yes?
Were they the ones, I'm trying to remember, that lived up on the mountain and the
Yes.
siege? Okay.
So Qumran is on the
Okay.
mountain where the Dead Sea Scrolls,
And
and
it's
again,
every day.
it's a group of them that did that. You can almost think of them as sort of like a monk subsection, the way that monks were a subsection of the Catholic Church. They were like the extreme version of what the rest of the Essenes were. Mark?
When you say mountain, where was Qumran? Is it still in Judea?
It's actually on, it's in Judea. It's basically near the edge of the Dead Sea in a mountainous region in Judea. I can't be more specific than that because I've never really paid that close of attention to the geography of it. But it is in Judea. It's well away from Jerusalem. It's an area that's not a place that you normally would just like go and hang out or anything. It's pretty rocky and unhospitable. So, okay, so. The emergence of the Sadducees. So when Greece is there, there's already been this group of people that are the pro-temple group, not just the Levites and the priests, but the Jews who have aligned themselves with the Levites and the priests, because the Levites and the priests have the power. And so what happens is that this group emerges as the Sadducees during this period of time. They are supporters of the Levites and the temple. Their power base is wealth and also the temple. So they are kind of the party of the upper class, you might think of it. And they were not beloved of the average Jew for that exact reason. But that is the group that sort of emerges first. And there's also a rise and increase in Jewish Hellenism. That is to say, Jews who are focused or interested in converting to Greek, not becoming Greeks, but in adapting Greek customs and ways of doing things to their way of doing things, and kind of getting them involved, even to the point of some who are in favor of worshiping other gods besides just Jehovah, although that is a real subset. And the Sadducees tended to be Hellenists. Let me rephrase that. Hellenists tend to be Sadducees. The Sadducees were more inclined towards this than the average Jew would have been. Okay, the early Sanhedrin is formed during this period of time. The Sanhedrin is the council of scholars and wise men made up of a combination of Pharisees and Sadducees. There are a variety of lesser Sanhedrins, they called them. There's one in each city throughout Judea, but the main Sanhedrin, the greater Sanhedrin, meets in Jerusalem. Whenever you see Sanhedrin referenced in the book of Acts, they're talking about the greater Sanhedrin, which is the one with the authority over all of the rest of the Jews. And so they become particularly significant. And then finally...
Were they civil as well as religious? I know Christ...
The Sanhedrin had civil powers as well as religious, secular ones, yes. They did not have... Their secular powers were limited, but they did have, for example, when Peter and John are picked up, when they tell them not to speak, that is both a religious thing, but it's also a civil thing. It's also a secular thing. They're able to say, we have authority, we're telling you not to do this, and we can punish you if you won't do it. And so there's a mixture of religious, but they're primarily religious, but there's definitely some secular authority in there too. Okay, so let's see here. Okay, so the development of the synagogue. The synagogue really starts to become a clear institution during this period of time. It merges those three aspects of prayer, worship, and meeting, or prayer, prayer, scripture reading, and meeting. And when you use the word scripture reading for Jews, that kind of encompasses worship a little more than just scripture reading. But prayer, scripture reading, and meeting are all involved in the concept of the synagogue. And so synagogues begin to arise throughout Jerusalem, throughout Judea, including in Jerusalem, even though the temple is there, as the center of Jewish religious life, and sometimes Jewish secular life. Probably the closest analog we can see today to this would actually be in the Latter-day Saints movement. Latter-day Saints have a number of temples, but you don't go to the temple to worship. They go to their, where's something escapes me, tabernacles. They have local churches, essentially. You want to go worship, they go worship there on Sundays or Wednesdays or whenever they get together. They worship there. You go to the temple for special reasons, to do special things, marriages, baptisms, things like that. And there's a lot of similarity to the Jewish system where they have the synagogues versus the actual temple. So, okay. The Hasmoneans. So the Greeks eventually get too unpleasant for the Jews to live with. There's a revolution led by the Maccabees, and eventually the Hasmonean Empire becomes dominant, and the Jews control their own territory for a while. So in this period of time that the Jewish canon is formalized, that is to say, I said it was being assembled under the Greek period of time. It is during the Hasmonean Empire that it is formalized. It's pretty much locked in by about AD 120 or something like that. Sorry, BC 120. The Jewish canon has pretty much been completely solidified.
Do you mean the 39 books of the Old Testament, or do you mean the Torah?
In this case, the 39 books of the Old Testament, the entire Old Testament. The Torah was pretty much established well before that.
Okay.
But for example, some of the latter books are not probably prevalent until the 300s or 200s BC, like Daniel and some of those other ones, where they would have been written in captivity and they would not have necessarily reached Judea very quickly because of that. So the Jewish canon is formalized, all of the 39 books. The Septuagint is completed in around 132 BC. The Septuagint, of course, is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. That becomes a significant aid in translation for a number of different modern-day translations, including some that relied on it perhaps a little too heavily because they didn't have access to some of the newer discoveries like the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so one of the advantages that some of the newer translations have is having access to some of these newer, more recently discovered finds, whereas some of the older translations are working off of a more limited set of information. And the Septuagint, even more so than the average Hebrew translation, has some translation errors in it because unlike the Hebrew where a scribe is writing down exactly what the words say, when you're translating from one language to another, there's always going to be translational errors. There's always going to be, I understand it this way, but everybody else understands it that way. Or, I thought it meant this when it really means this. There's no way to get a perfect translation. And so the Septuagint is tremendously successful, but nevertheless it's imperfect. And so it ultimately leads to some imperfect translations as a result. So, my favorite one of these, I think I might have mentioned this in a previous class or sermon, is the Michelangelo. Michelangelo created a sculpture of Moses when he comes down from the mountain with the Ten Commandments, and the Septuagint, at least some of the translations of the Septuagint, mistranslated the idea that his face, or that he was radiant, to mean that he had horns. So Michelangelo sculpted him with little horns. It's very. I've seen the statue. It's really cool, but it's weird. You know. So some of those things happen. Okay. At this point, the Sanhedrin also becomes the power. They're where there's the king, the Hasmonean king, but the Sanhedrin becomes basically Congress to the Hasmonean king's president. And they become way more powerful. They're as powerful as they're going to be. And then finally, you just have this ongoing competition and disagreement between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. The Pharisees have developed out of a reaction to the Sadducees, a reaction to what they see as an increasing misuse of the temple and secularization of Jerusalem and Judea, and so they emerge as a group of scholars and scribes and religious restorationists who want to go back to a more God-centered and Bible Bible-centered way of doing things. And so they become sort of the opponents of the Sadducees.
When was their book written?
What book?
You're
talking about the oral tradition that was the Talmud?
Yeah.
Well, it's tricky because it was written over the course of about 1,500 years, so it's kind of hard to nail it down. It started being written somewhere around, probably somewhere between 400 and 600 BC, and
so not even this early then.
No, it's before this.
Oh,
before
BC.
Okay. BC, yeah. So it started being written during the period of time that they were in captivity, or shortly afterwards, and it continued to be written for 1,000 years after.
So it wasn't written then by the Pharisees, it was written by...
Well, partly. So the Pharisees are going to become what we would think of today as the rabbis. In fact, they were called rabbis. Many of them were called rabbis back then. They're going to become the basis of Rabbinical Judaism today. Rabbinical Judaism is the progenitors and the proponents of the Talmud, along with the Torah. The Torah is the Talmud is the now written down oral tradition that the Pharisees and then later the rabbis claimed was spoken by Moses just to a select few who didn't even talk about it until after Daniel. But, whatever. But it takes a long period of time for these things to develop, because the Talmud is not, it's not just like the Torah. If you go in and read the Torah, it's like, it's God saying this, or Moses saying this, or this event taking place, or whatever. The Talmud is, here's what Rabbi so-and-so said, and here's what Rabbi so-and-so said about what Rabbi so-and-so said. And so the Talmud is not just it's organized very differently, it functions very differently from the Torah.
It's like a commentary?
You could call it that, except that it's not, because it has the force of regulation and law. So in the first century, a significant portion of the Talmud had been developed, especially to deal with things that were different than the way they had been under when the Jews had controlled their own kingdom. And so the Talmud, you have these regulations that Jesus talks about as being the regulations of man. So as Christians, we can say, knowing what Jesus said about this, we can definitively say that the Talmud, unlike the Torah, unlike those 39 books that were part of the canon, the Talmud is not inspired. The Talmud is not from God. The Talmud is a bunch of men trying to figure out how to make the regulations of the Torah and of the 39 books of the Old Testament fit into or answer all the questions of a modern society that they weren't really ever designed to deal with. And so that's where you have problems, is because it's not just a commentary, it's actually, here's what this means, here's how this works and stuff. And so it's confusing and complicated, and I'm really glad I'm not a Jew and have to deal with some of that stuff. But anyway, okay, so let's see. This is just all over the place. Let's just bring them all up here. I don't know what went wrong with this, but anyway. So Sadducees and Pharisees, there are core argument we're just talking about this is the Talmud, which is that oral tradition, which is of course now being written down. So it was supposedly oral, it stayed oral for all this time, and now we're writing it down because we need to have it written so everybody can have answers to these things that they didn't know how to do. We have the Essenes. We talked about them a little bit already, but now they are really they're really humming in terms of writing all their stuff and the scrolls and stuff like that. And then finally we have the rise of the Herodians. Herod and his children are going to rise up and take power. Finally we have Rome, and we talked about this one just last week, so I'll make it quick. In Rome we have Pax Romana, the Roman peace that lasts from 27 BC until AD 180. We have Koine Greek being replaced by Latin. Now Koine Greek was still spoken by the vast majority of people, but Latin was increasingly used, and it was particularly used for all official documents and purposes. And Latin is significant because it becomes the basis for the majority of Western languages, modern Western languages. We had the legions, the troops and soldiers that served Rome. We had all the public works, the roads and the waterways and all the different things that they created. And of course, we had the taxes that paid for all these other nice things. And taxes were one of the main things that the Jews hated about being Roman citizens. Yes, ma'am?
So the Koine Greek, did that replace the Aramaic, or was, okay, and then Latin, and then we go back to
And
Aramaic?
the reason I didn't mention it is because Koine Greek, while it does replace Aramaic in a lot of places, it doesn't really replace it in Judea, because the Jews in general don't want anything to do with Hellenism and Greek stuff. So while some Jews did start speaking Koine Greek, and I suspect most of them could understand a little bit of it, the majority of Jews never started speaking Koine Greek, and they really never started speaking Latin either. They kind of stuck with Aramaic.
That's why the New Testament is in Aramaic.
Is in Greek, yes, primarily.
Aramaic.
What was
A mixture, some Aramaic and some Greek, actually.
Okay.
A lot of the New Testament is in Greek.
Okay.
Yes.
That's what I was.
Yeah, so by the time the New Testament is written, well, like I said, Latin has become the official language of the Roman Empire, and it's what they put on official documents. Most unofficial stuff is still written in Greek, and Greek is still primarily spoken. And so overwhelmingly, the New Testament is written in Greek, because overwhelmingly it's being written to Greeks who need to be able to read it. So the few things that are in Aramaic are the ones, the letters that seem to be directed specifically at the Jewish population, or Jewish Christian population, I should say. So, okay, so finally then Rome, we have Herod the Great, reigning from 37 BC to either 4 or 1, depending on which historical source you look at. Herod is the one who refurbished the temple and made it into the majestic structure that it was during Jesus' time. The Romans also allow, and the Jews enforce, a temple tax that helps to pay for the maintenance of the temple. The Hasmonean line comes to an end completely, so there aren't any more Jewish kings out there. Not from that line. Now the line of David is a different question. And then finally, we see Herod the Great's kingdom being divided. And that takes us actually back to where we started today. So it's kind of this interesting little circular thing that we've got going on here. So we're going to stop there. Do we have any questions, any additional ones? Yes, sir.
So, what did Jesus speak? I always thought it was Greek.
Aramaic, most likely.
Aramaic, okay.
He probably also spoke Hebrew to some extent, and he was probably at least vaguely familiar with Greek, but his primary language would have been Aramaic. That was what was used during that time.
Paul spoke.
Paul, we don't know how many languages Paul spoke. Paul would have surely spoken Greek.
He spoke Hebrew.
Because he was a Pharisee, he would have spoken at least, or he would have at least been capable of reading and writing Hebrew. Whether he spoke it or not, he would have been capable.
Well, he spoke Hebrew on the stairs when he was talking to the
Right.
group.
So, but whether he was truly fluent in Hebrew, I wouldn't necessarily know for sure. But I think that Paul probably knew at least 4 languages: Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, and Latin, to varying degrees of familiarity because of who he was and his background and his education and, frankly, his intelligence, I suspect.
And he may have had help from some greater source.
That too. I don't consider that knowing so much as just having, it's like having a translator device with you, you know. It's not that you know how to do it, it's just that somebody's going to take care of it for you, so. Okay, any other questions? Yes, sir.
I was just going to say, you could tell that God had a lot to do with the Roman thing. Even, I know, at the start with Jesus' birth and so on, but then after his ascension and the church starting, Rome had already built roads and all that stuff, so the gospel spread a lot faster and easier than it would have back, a century before, because they would have been nomads, it would have been in tents and everything. Instead, it had changed to this kind of a lifestyle where it spread so much quickly, and people would come to Jerusalem and then was able to leave on roads and get there a lot, get back with the good news. It was kind of the perfect time, and that was God's.
Yes. Absolutely. And it was actually a more narrow window than we realized. Even though the Roman Empire lasted for a long time, its consolidated control over the entire Mediterranean and Western European region was not that long. It was not for that long a period of time. And so a lot of things happened. There was urbanization, a lot more people living in cities than had before. There was the fact that you could move from one part of the empire to another with very little difficulty, whereas if you'd gone and tried to do it during the Greek Empire, you would have been going from one warring state to another, basically, to move around, and that would make it very difficult. As you said, there are roads now. Shipbuilding and commerce in general have become much more successful and much more capable than they were even under the Greeks. There's a lot of different things like that. The key to the Roman Empire and understanding why it was so successful is to understand that the Romans never met a good idea that they wouldn't steal. All right, and that sounds like a bad thing, but it's really not. The mistake that a lot of us make in our lives, and the mistake that most empires and most nations make, is that when they encounter something new, they automatically assume it's a bad thing because it's not the way they do it. The Romans never had that mindset. The Romans believed that they were better than everyone else, but part of the reason they thought that is because they figured that they put together all the best things that everybody else had come up with. So if you looked at just like the weapons of their soldiers, for example, their swords came from one place. They were designed by one kind of force. Their shields were designed by a completely different place. Their spear was an idea from a completely different group of people. Everything they did was basically, what's the best way to do this? Oh, you've got a better way. Let's do it that way now. And so the Romans were constantly improving, and were constantly expanding, and were constantly making their empire more stable until they weren't. Because of that approach to things. And when it starts to fall apart, part of it is because it does become stagnant. They stop looking for good new ideas, and they assume that they are the best that it can be. And they stop taking seriously the things that are necessary to grow and to continue to persevere, and they just start getting lazy and fat, and the result is exactly what you'd expect.
I was thinking about Luke's comment about Athens. I mean, that's just exactly what he said, that they're constantly looking for something new.
Well, in their case, though, it wasn't a good thing.
Well,
because in Athens' case, what it was is they were just constantly looking for some new way to amuse themselves.
Well, yeah,
whereas
probably.
the Romans were constantly looking for something new to make themselves better. And I think that's kind of what made them so strong and so successful, was constantly looking to improve themselves. So, okay, we got to stop. We are well over time at this point. So thank you guys for your participation. Next week we're going to be doing something quite different. So, yeah.